Good Monday. Here we are back with another IG Live. I was kind of missing doing these. Kind of fun to do them again. Railtown, what's up, Railtown? You guys could go check out Railtown's page, man. He's got one of the sickest rooms for mastering. Cool, what's everyone up to today? I'm just taking a little break from the last little bit of work from today and thought I'd jump on. And also wanted to jump on and talk about my post earlier, the poll that I did for my question was, is music subjective? And we got some, yeah, you're welcome, dude. We got some really cool responses. We had about 20 people respond to the poll, and most of it was in favor of yes, it's subjective, and about 3 or 4 people saying that it's not subjective. And ultimately, my take on it is that depending on specifically what you're speaking of as far as music, it could go either way. And, before we dive into it a little bit deeper, let's see who else jumps on here. But my point of view is that music is not subjective. And when I say music is not subjective, I'm speaking specifically about music in itself. Music being made up of theories and strategies and standards that are true. When something's objective, it's, in my opinion, where it can't be refuted. So there are, like, take the chromatic scale, for instance. You got 12 notes within an octave, and that's pretty much true. So in that sense, music is objective. But I think what most people who voted that yes, it is subjective. What's up, brother? I think what the people who voted that it is subjective were referring to as musical taste. Now, musical taste, it's just like any other art form. And yes, at that point, I would say it is subjective. But the way that I like to think about how to distinguish between the two is kind of like food. Like, I know vegetables are, good for my health, advantageous. And I may not like vegetables like somebody else. So that's the subjective side of it. But the objective side is that vegetables have been proven to be good for our health. So that's kind of the way I see music and its subjectivity or objectivity. Creativity is definitely subjective. We are free to create on our own terms. And, call it right, call it wrong. There is no rules when it comes to that as far as creativity. That's what makes creating music so much fun and so personal. So, but along with that does go the whole, you may be listening to or enjoy terrible, objectively bad music. And how do we arrive at that conclusion that something is objectively bad music? Well, and again, if I'm going up, it's because I'm reading off my notes because there were some points that I wanted to touch on. But there's something that I like to call objective critical appeal. And that's basically how we separate the subjective logic and we introduce the objective judgment to that art. And typically this is done through what society and culture dictates. What's considered good or bad. Again, those words are, they're moving targets. But for the most part, if something's been deemed to sound bad, then yeah, it's gonna sound bad based on the critical appeal. I'm not talking about so much about awards or anything like that specifically, because those can also be subjective, but more in terms of what society has deemed bad sounding. And again, there's certain standards. Like for instance, if you are within a chromatic scale, and I mean in our Western music, of course, there's certain notes that we use and we stay the 12 notes. Um, but if you were just to all of a sudden get out of that scale, it may or may not work. And when it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Like there's like a clear audible indication that it doesn't sound good. It sounds bad. But that doesn't mean that there happy accidents within those standards and best practices of music. Right or wrong, I find they're coming up a lot. Well, I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's a good point you're making about right and wrong. Like in terms of morality, I guess you're talking about. But again, yeah, morality falls into those parameters as well. But as a society, as a culture, we've sort of determined what is good and what is bad. Hence, why when someone commits, a crime, they are no longer deemed to be fit to be in society, so they are separated and hopefully rehabilitated so that they can rejoin society and be contributing members of that society. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of that way. I mean, consequences are different, of course, but from a mastering standpoint, that's really where more I was asking that question. I know it was kind of vague because it was just, is music subjective? And again, recapping, some people most likely were talking about musical taste. Is musical taste subjective? And of course it is. But music in itself, there are certain rules, if you want to call them that when, I guess, the first instruments were being created, the first people were actually like putting, I guess you call like a math to music, because there is math involved in some way. That's really where we get the foundation of what music actually is. So that is objective because there are truths in that. But from a mastering, some people think certain things are right. Some people think things are wrong. It's subjective, but we have a basis. So we have a foundation, a ground. Yeah, so I mean, we can feel free to believe things are right or wrong, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that they would be correct or that they would align with what society and culture tells us is right or wrong. Again, the whole example of if you are if you commit a crime or something like that. Like for instance, my kids, 5 and 7 years old. My 5-year-old knows that, or even my 7-year-old, they know that if they were to be mean to each other or one of them wants to hit the other, they understand that it's in their best interest not to do those things because we're part of a social group, our family dynamic, and they know that if they are bad, in the sense of bad of bringing harm to their brother, they know that they're going to be separated, which in this case is grounded, go to your room, privileges taken away, that sort of thing. So they understand that from an early age, from our parenting and also from society, that like when our kids, when they were in school, that it's in their best interest to abide by those norms that society teaches us. But going back to looking at this from a mastering standpoint, some of the things that I consider when I'm listening to music objectively as a mastering engineer, and I know I say that sometimes where I try to be an objective third party to the process of the music, where the producer and the artist have been working on this. They have tons and tons of hours. The mixers have been working on it for a long time. And the reason why I like to think of it as an objective role is because I am trying to hit certain points in my critical listening and observation of the music that I think help me stay on that objective side. And I'll go through the points so I can kind of make my point clear. Now, that's not to say that these points can't sway into subjective. They totally can, and there's some that do, there's some that don't. But again, I really feel like I don't have as much invested in those projects as the people coming before me have, including time, money, energy, all that stuff. So one of the first things I that I consider and that I look at and I take into account when I'm listening or working on a project is the format. And that to me is objective because the format is the format. And basically what that is what is the medium? Is it a digital file? Is it an analog file? I don't work too much on analog files. Most of the stuff I get is going to be in a digital format of some kind. But when I refer to formats, is what sample rate is it in? What bit depth it's in? So those things are objective to the product, what's coming in, the mix that's coming into my studio. Where it becomes subjective, I guess, is what is best. And there's so much debate about it. At the end of the day, I mean, it really comes down to several things. How high of a resolution can you record at? How, like your setup, what will that allow for? What is the goal? What is the genre? What is, those things really play a factor in deciding at what formats you're going to be recording and mixing at. And also, are you going to be doing any type of sample rate conversion? Do you trust your converters to do that in your DAW? So I guess that side of it could potentially be subjective, but what I'm referring to more is when it arrives to me and it's in my studio, in my hands, there is a format and that's what it is. It's the truth. So first and foremost, looking at the formats, to me that's objective. Sound quality, that's the next thing that I look at, and that can be both objective and subjective, because what to me could be a good sound quality could not necessarily be the same to another mastering engineer. Or perhaps the goal of the mix was to have a lo-fi sound, which is common. Sometimes you get mixes that were intentionally recorded and mixed a certain way, which to somebody who is used to hearing a certain type of sound quality in mixes would say, well, this is lo-fi, this is, sounds more downgraded or not as high res or 3D. So sound quality again can be objective and subjective, but to me, sound quality is objective in my role, in my position as a mastering engineer, because what I'm being hired to do is I'm being hired to bring out the best qualities of a mix, and perhaps, I don't want to say fix, because there is fixing and repair involved, but I'd like to think that by enhancing the better elements of a mix, of the song, of music, you are by then taking away the focus on the things that may be considered not so good, which again aren't necessarily bad. They just perhaps aren't up to a standard. So sound quality to me is more of what we're used to hearing in what our music culture has determined to be good sound quality, which is typically associated with higher formats and higher resolution formats. The next thing I like to think about when I'm approaching a master and trying to look at it objectively is the mix cohesiveness. And again, this, most people would say, yeah, it's subjective. But from a mastering standpoint, I like to think of it more as objective because, for instance, there's times when you may get a mix and certain elements might feel disconnected. Perhaps they are too out front, too pokey, or too hidden, and this takes me to a point that I'm going to touch on later, but this is where it's very important to have those conversations with the artist, with the producer, with the mixer, whoever is giving you the direction of the masters. Are these things intentional? Because if they're intentional, then at that point they're objective. They're no longer a taste thing. They're no longer a musical taste or what I think. it's what was the goal, and that is objective. That's what it needs to be. That's what needs to be respected. So when it comes to the cohesiveness of the track, for the most part, you wouldn't want anything to stand out too much or feel, like I said, disconnected or not part of the mix. It's been kind of already set in our industry that a good mix is typically a good balance, and that means balance both in frequency response and also in instrumentation, placement, and we use references to help us determine if we're working with a cohesive mix. So again, mix cohesiveness could potentially be viewed as subjective, yes, because if that's the goal and that's what you choose, that's your taste of what it should sound like. But at the end of the day, when it reaches me, that is now objective, because I am not introducing any of my personal taste at that point. I am simply relying on the direction of the creators to let me know where that track needs to go. Also, the track itself. Another thing that I look at is the track energy, which could be viewed as the loudness. But I'm talking more about maybe RMS, the perceived loudness, and the dynamics. These things can be looked at subjectively, because, again, there's no rules as far as there's recommendations of what mixes should be reaching as far as RMS and volume and dynamics. But at the end of the day, make whatever type of mix that you want to make. That is the whole beauty of creating music, is you have the ability to do that. But where it becomes objective is where we can actually meter these things. We can actually put a number to these things. And to me, that's where it becomes objective. For instance, I like to hit my analog chain when I come out of my D to A. I like to hit it at a certain level because it's almost, I want to say, proven through my personal experience. And yes, it's subjective in a way because every chain is different and every approach to how you send out is different. But we do have standards, and equipment is built to a certain calibration where it's going to perform better at that optimal level. So that in itself is objective, because you're going to find that most of the time, if not all the time, better results if you follow those guidelines. So, the track energy and the dynamics can be measured and can be affected, using certain standards and practices which are pretty much true to both our processing and the way we perceive it. So again, another one that could be subjective, but from looking at it from a mastering engineer's perspective, most likely it's going to be objective. And again, we take direction to tell us what kind of master we're looking for. A dynamic master, a not so dynamic, which basically just, doesn't mean that you lost dynamics. It just means it's louder more of the time of the track as the song goes along. Another thing that I like to look at is going to be the mixed depth and the mixed width. Again, subjective. You can have a narrow mix, and that's perfectly fine if that's the goal. But from a mastering perspective, we have certain targets. There are certain standards that have been, kind of proven to gain critical appeal as far as, certain genres. If you're used to hearing things being a little bit wider, they're going to have a better chance of being accepted as good. Okay? But that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that that's just an objective perspective, because unfortunately there's no other way to determine if something is good or bad without introducing that type of objectivity, that type of judgment. Without it, it would just be, we wouldn't have any type of guide or any type of direction, you know. And in a way, who knows, that might be something to think about as far as the direction of music. But anyway, depth and width of a mix can be viewed as both objective and subjective. But from my point of view, I try to look at it more from objective and a more technical aspect. And finally, the targeted loudness, which again, going back to the point previous as far as RMS, and some people look at LUFS and other measurements of loudness. To me, loudness is going to be subjective and objective again. Objective in the sense that, for instance, let's take Spotify, with the recent adaptation of -14 LUFS, even though they've always had some kind of normalization. Now, if you look at their FAQs all over the place, now it actually has -14 and that sort of stuff. So now, let's not get started on that subject. That's for another video. But what I'm talking about is the target loudness objective or subjective? Well, it could be subjective in the sense that somebody could get a master and say, "Hey, can you make this louder?" Or it's too loud. Can you bring it down, make it quieter? Or you have those clients that simply don't even care. They aren't worried about that, and all they're hoping for, is that it translates the best it can over multiple systems. But I like to look at it from an objective standpoint, where we have norms that tell us that usually when you're within these numbers and these parameters, it's going to make for a master that is going to translate the best that it can through multiple playback systems. Me personally, I like to keep my stuff in a certain RMS area. I look at my loudness range, my loudness to peak levels and things like that, where I'm able to confidently say, hey, this is gonna most likely translate well on these platforms, or if it goes to CD, or if it even if it goes to vinyl. Now, that would be one of the ones that I would want to definitely know about before I begin the project, because vinyl does have certain limitations, and it's not rare for me to treat it a little different if I know it's going to go to vinyl. But that doesn't mean I'm going to make a ton of masters, different versions. Most of the time, one master is going to be suitable for all mediums. And I know there's a lot of people who disagree with that. They'll make, a streaming master, a CD master, a vinyl master, and that's great. If that works for you, awesome. But I find that for me and my workflow, not really going to be what I'm looking for. So those are some of the things that I look for when I'm considering music and I'm trying to listen objectively and wear that hat. It's funny, I was talking to a client the other day, and I was just like, it's so refreshing when I finish a project, because then I can just forget about all that. I can forget about objectivity, and I can just be a fan, and I can just enjoy the music. I can blast it in my car. I can, hear it on my headphones or whatever, and just not worry about that, and enjoy the lyricism, enjoy the creativity behind the music. But those are typically things that I'm not paying attention to when I'm working as a mastering engineer. I'm more concerned about the technical aspect of things and how well it's going to perform out in the world. So to me, over-processing is one of the common mistakes in the mastering stage that is no longer objective. Respecting the artist and the vision, and understanding how your room and speakers interact with the music and how you interpret that to me is objectivity. So it's a combination of things. It's a combination of, why are you being hired? Most of the time I'm being hired for, of course, my previous work and the way I work, but most importantly, it's for my environment, my listening environment, my approach to listening, and the type of mindset that I approach mastering. But most importantly, it's just understanding and being able to interpret how how that mix is going to translate not only in your listening space but also out in the world. And it's like, for instance, physics, and those are objective. The way your speakers are pushing air and energy in the room, that is objective. Now, if it sounds good or if it sounds bad, okay, well, that's subjective. But the way we measure rooms and the way we calibrate and tune our speakers and tune the room with acoustic treatment and that sort of stuff, to a certain point, it's subjective, because there are certain things that can be measured and can be, quantified. They can actually be measured and determined and improved, or, the opposite. So that's the real key, I think, is understanding how your listening environment is going to interact with mixes, and what a mix should sound like in your room to make the type of master that you're looking for. Again, not a good or a bad master, just the type of master that you're envisioning. So ultimately, I try to remove my personal taste, and I let the music lead me, while at the same time using personal experience and the interpretation of the music to kind of get us there at the goal of what we want it to sound like. The client's requests for revisions and the client's requests for changes, if there are any. Now, this changes my perspective from personal taste to objectivity, because at that point, there is no more me. It helps me to remove the ego. It helps me to remove the me. And at that point, I am just I don't want to say a machine, because I still have human interaction, but what I'm getting at is, I'm just a vessel to get that vision through to the end, and through my room, my equipment, and that sort of thing. But once you get the song mastered to a certain place using objectivity, but also a dash of personal taste, I guess, is where you get those notes and comments and feedback back from the client, and that's when it all really should shift to a different perspective. Because now is when if you didn't before, and you didn't, most of the time I find that if I get it on the first try, it's because I took the time to listen, to really get a feel for where they wanted the track to go. But if not, then that is really where you need to buckle down and say, okay, no more me, no more personal taste, no more I wanted to use this because I thought it sounded cool. No, it's more of like, okay, what is the client request? What is their revision? And let's get it there by me removing myself from the equation. So anyway, that was what I wanted to touch on. It was awesome. Had a few people log on and comment. That's so great. I really appreciate everybody taking time out of their day. I'm going to get back to finishing up my day, but just wanted to say this is my perspective on, is music subjective or not? And to me, music is not subjective. Y'all have a good one. Take care. Love one another. Peace.